I used to think that when a family finally breaks apart, there would be some kind of loud warning. I expected screaming matches, shattered plates, or doors slamming so hard the house would shake. But the night my family essentially completely fractured, it did not happen with a bang. It happened with the soft clinking of expensive silverware and a smirk across a dinner table. My brother, Vance, leaned back in his leather chair. He had that relaxed, untouchable posture of a man who firmly believed the world was just a stage built specifically for his convenience. He held a glass of sparkling water, resting it against his chest, and looked right through me. The restaurant was faintly humming with background conversations, but our private dining room was suffocatingly quiet. Vance looked at me, smiled with the kind of practiced pity you give a stray dog, and said, "You are a disgrace to our legacy, Caleb. You do not deserve to carry our name, and you certainly do not deserve a place in the family trust." He did not raise his voice. He delivered the sentence like it was a basic fact, like stating the weather or the time of day. And the most damaging part was not the words themselves. The most damaging part was the reaction from the people who were supposed to love us equally. My mother, Patricia, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a subtle movement, but to me it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the nod of a woman who had spent 32 years convincing herself that Vance's arrogance was actually leadership, and that my quiet dedication was just a lack of ambition. She smoothed her pearl necklace, her face a mask of tragic agreement, as if Vance had bravely diagnosed an illness the family had been trying to ignore for decades. Then there was my father, Robert. He did not agree out loud. He did not nod. Instead, he simply lowered his eyes to his plate of roasted duck, suddenly fascinated by the arrangement of the vegetables. He stared down, completely surrendering his spine, pretending that if he did not make eye contact, he would not be complicit in the execution of his youngest son. That was his specialty. He weaponized his silence to maintain his own comfort. Nobody laughed. Nobody gasped. Everyone simply watched me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. For my entire life, that had been the expected dynamic. Vance would push, Vance would insult, Vance would claim the spotlight, and I was expected to absorb it. I was expected to either get defensive, which would make me look unstable, or get quiet, which would make me look weak. They wanted me to flush with anger, maybe stammer an apology, or storm out of the room so they could all shake their heads and talk about how sensitive and erratic I was. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not blink. I felt a deep, freezing coldness spread through my chest, replacing any remaining warmth I had for the people sitting at that table. I am a forensic accountant by trade. I spend my days tracking hidden money, exposing corporate lies, and dismantling offshore tax evasion schemes. I deal in absolute, concrete facts. I am trained to remove emotion from the equation and look purely at the data. And the data sitting across from me was clear. This was not a family anymore. This was a hostile takeover. I just sat there, my face completely blank, taking a slow sip of my water. I could see the slight irritation flicker in Vance's eyes. My lack of a meltdown was ruining his triumphant moment. He needed me to fall apart to prove his point to the rest of the room. He needed me to look small so he could look monumental. He adjusted the cuffs of his $5,000 custom suit, getting ready to launch another verbal attack, firmly believing that he had already won the war. He thought the family name was his inheritance to control, and I was just an obstacle he had finally cleared away. This was not a casual Sunday lunch. This was my grandfather Arthur's 82nd birthday dinner, and Vance had turned it into a theatrical performance. The private dining room was lavish, located in a high-end restaurant built right on the riverfront. Ironically, the restaurant itself used to be part of the old Callaway Works repair yards decades ago, before the area was gentrified. The exposed brick walls and the polished iron beams across the ceiling were kept for rustic charm. But the people sitting at the tables now knew absolutely nothing about the heavy labor that had actually built those walls. Vance had meticulously curated the guest list. Our family attorney, Mr. Bell, was seated near the head of the table. There were a few wealthy donors connected to the family's apprenticeship foundation, and sitting near the corner was a man in a sharp gray suit who clearly did not belong at a family birthday dinner. I recognized him. He was a senior acquisitions director for Mercer Lane Development, a massive real estate conglomerate known for buying out industrial properties and turning them into overpriced luxury condominiums. The presence of the Mercer Lane representative told me everything I needed to know. Vance was not just trying to humiliate me. He was putting on a show for his investors. He was trying to demonstrate that he had absolute authority over the family, the trust, and the Callaway properties. By publicly declaring me unworthy and a disgrace, he was signaling to the developer that there would be no internal resistance when he tried to sell out our grandfather's legacy. He was assuring them that I was eliminated from the board of the trust. As Vance continued to bask in the silence he had created, my hand slowly moved to the inside pocket of my jacket. My fingers brushed against a small, cold piece of metal. It was a secure USB flash drive. It weighed less than an ounce, but I knew the information it contained was heavy enough to completely crush Vance's entire existence. Inside that drive were 40 pages of digitized bank statements, routing numbers, offshore limited liability company registrations, and wire transfer logs that I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously compiling. I looked around the room, observing the stark contrast between the elegant setting and the dirty reality of what was happening. The crystal chandeliers reflected off the wine glasses, casting warm light on the smiling faces of the guests who thought they were witnessing a passing of the torch. Vance had spent the entire evening leading up to this moment working the room. I had watched him glide from table to table, shaking hands, clapping men on the back, and using corporate buzzwords like synergy, legacy modernization, and forward-thinking asset management. He spoke confidently about moving the Callaway name into the 21st century, heavily implying that the old ways of doing things were holding us back. He was incredibly charismatic. I will give him that. Vance had a talent for making people feel like they were part of an exclusive club just by listening to him speak. But I knew the truth. I knew that beneath the expensive cologne and the perfectly styled hair, he was completely hollow. He produced nothing. He built nothing. He only knew how to take things that other people had built, slap his name on them, and sell them for a commission. I kept my hand on the flash drive in my pocket. I did not pull it out. Timing is everything in an audit, and it is everything in a confrontation. If I threw the accusations out now, it would just look like two brothers fighting. Vance would spin it. He would use his charm to deflect, and my mother would jump in to protect him, claiming I was just being jealous and vindictive. I needed the final blow to come not from a place of emotional sibling rivalry, but from a place of absolute, undeniable authority. I needed the judge to enter the room. I needed Grandpa Arthur. Up until that moment, my grandfather had been exceptionally quiet. Arthur Callaway was a man who commanded respect without ever having to demand it. He had built Callaway Works from a single, rusted water pump repair shop into a massive community institution. He spent his life with grease under his fingernails and sweat on his brow. He was not a man of high society, even though his success had eventually placed him there. He sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. He had been slowly eating his dinner, watching the entire dynamic play out. He watched Vance puff up his chest. He watched my mother smile in blind devotion. He watched my father stare cowardly at his plate. And he watched me, sitting completely still, refusing to take the bait. When Vance said the words, declaring me a disgrace, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the patriarch of the family would agree with the golden child. Vance had clearly expected Grandpa to nod, to give his blessing, and to officially hand over the keys to the kingdom. Instead, the heavy wooden chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Grandpa Arthur stood up. He moved slowly, his 82 years showing in his joints, but his presence was towering. The room instantly fell dead silent. Even the waitstaff hovering near the doors froze in place. My mother sat up straighter, a hopeful, expectant smile plastered on her face, ready for her favorite son to be crowned. Vance leaned forward slightly, practically vibrating with anticipation. Grandpa did not look angry. He did not look disappointed. He looked entirely calm, which was the most terrifying expression he could possibly have. He looked directly at Vance, holding his gaze until Vance's confident smirk began to slightly waver at the edges. "So," Grandpa Arthur said, his voice deep and steady, carrying effortlessly to every corner of the private room, "you believe Caleb does not deserve to carry the Calloway name. You believe he is a disgrace to our legacy." Vance swallowed hard, but he tried to maintain his bravado. "I am just saying what everyone is thinking, Grandpa. We need strong leadership. Caleb just doesn't have the vision to protect what you built." Grandpa nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, sliding them onto his face. He looked at Vance, then looked across the table at me, and finally addressed the entire room. "Actually," Grandpa Arthur said, the calmness in his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees, "Caleb is the only one sitting at this table right now who is not going to federal prison for wire fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. Vance's face went completely slack. The arrogant smirk vanished so fast it was almost comical. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and sickly in the warm restaurant lighting. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. My mother's hand flew to her chest, her gasp loud and sharp. The Mercer Lane developer sitting in the corner suddenly sat up perfectly straight, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating how fast he could legally exit the building. "What?" Vance finally managed to whisper, his voice cracking. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Grandpa, no. You can't say things like that. You can't do this to me." Grandpa Arthur did not raise his voice. He simply took a folded piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. "I did not do anything to you, Vance. You did it to yourself. Pack your bags." To understand how my brother managed to financially execute himself in front of a room full of high-powered attorneys and real estate developers, you have to rewind. You have to go back to the beginning to understand the stark contrast in how Vance and I were built, and how my family actively manufactured the monster sitting at the dinner table. I am 32 years old, and I have always been the auditor of the family, not just by profession but by personality. While Vance was loud, I was observant. While he demanded attention, I preferred the background. Growing up, I quickly learned that the safest place to be in my household was out of the way. Vance is 2 years older, and from the moment he could walk, my mother decided he was destined for greatness. He was the golden child. Everything he did was magnified and celebrated. If he scored a point in a little league game, it was treated like an Olympic victory. If he failed a math test, it was the teacher's fault for not recognizing his unique learning style. My parents shielded him from every single consequence. They created a reality where Vance was never wrong, and the world simply owed him whatever he wanted. As we grew into adults, that dynamic only hardened. Vance became a corporate investment broker. It was the perfect career for his specific type of narcissism. He sold the illusion of wealth. He leased luxury cars he could barely afford, wore watches that cost more than my annual rent, and lived in a downtown loft that looked great on social media but was always on the verge of foreclosure. He was constantly talking about his network, his net worth, and his next big move. He used people as stepping stones, discarding friends and colleagues the second they were no longer useful to his personal brand. I went in the exact opposite direction. I became a forensic accountant. I did not want to sell illusions. I wanted to dismantle them. I specialize in data analysis and financial fraud investigation. I spend my days staring at spreadsheets, tracking hidden assets, and finding the lies that people try to bury in complex tax returns. My job is not glamorous. I do not wear $5,000 suits. I wear comfortable shirts, drink bad office coffee, and systematically destroy criminals using nothing but their own receipt trails. My family viewed my career as a tedious, boring necessity. To my mother, being an accountant was not prestigious enough to brag about at her country club luncheons. When relatives asked what I did, She would vaguely wave her hand and say, "Oh, Caleb works with numbers in a back office somewhere. He is very steady." Steady was her polite code word for boring. Meanwhile, she would spend 30 minutes describing Vance's latest hypothetical real estate deal as if he had just cured a major disease. I accepted this role for a long time. I believed that if I just kept my head down, did my job, and remained self-sufficient, I would eventually earn their genuine respect. I paid for my own college through scholarships and part-time jobs while my parents drained their savings to fund Vance's extravagant frat house lifestyle. I never asked them for a dime. I established absolute financial independence because I hated the idea of owing them anything. I thought that by being the reliable, low-maintenance son, they would eventually see my value. But families run by a golden child dynamic do not reward self-sufficiency. They actually resent it. My independence meant they could not control me. It meant I did not need them, which made them focus entirely on Vance, who constantly needed bailouts, emotional support, and endless validation. I was the good son, which simply meant I was the invisible son. And for years, I swallowed that bitterness, convincing myself that it did not matter, as long as I had my own life. The only place I ever felt truly seen in my family was down by the river, inside the rusted, oil-stained walls of Callaway Works. My grandfather started the company 50 years ago. He repaired heavy industrial water pumps and emergency drainage systems. It was brutal, backbreaking work, but it was honest. Later in his life, when the company became highly profitable, Grandpa Arthur did not cash out and move to a private island. Instead, he turned the massive main warehouse into the Callaway Apprenticeship Foundation. He brought in kids who had aged out of the foster care system, kids with juvenile records, and kids from the poorest neighborhoods who could not afford trade school. He gave them tools, taught them welding, mechanics, and heavy machinery repair, and paid them a living wage while they learned. I loved that workshop. When I was a teenager, I spent my summers there. I did not have the physical build to haul giant steel pipes, but I was good with numbers. Grandpa put me in the small glass office overlooking the floor, teaching me how to balance the inventory ledgers, track equipment depreciation, and manage the payroll. It was in that dusty office that I learned the truth about numbers. They never lie. People will lie to your face, they will gaslight you, they will twist reality to fit their narrative, but a balance sheet is an absolute truth. A missing $500 on a ledger tells a story that no amount of charming words can erase. I also loved the people in the workshop. I loved the apprentices. They were rough around the edges, sure, but they were real. There was a kid named Leo who started working there 3 years ago. Leo had grown up sleeping in cars and bouncing between group homes. When he first arrived at Callaway Works, he was angry, defensive, and ready to fight everyone. But Grandpa Arthur just handed him a wrench and told him to fix a busted diesel engine. Within 2 years, Leo was one of the best junior mechanics on the floor. The workshop did not just give him a paycheck. It gave him a spine. It gave him dignity. Vance hated the workshop. He hated the smell of the machine oil, he hated the noise, and he hated the apprentices. Whenever he was forced to visit for family photo opportunities, he would complain about the dirt getting on his shoes. He looked at the kids like Leo not as human beings getting a second chance, but as an annoying charity case that was draining resources from his future inheritance. To Vance, the Callaway name was a brand that he could exploit for social capital. He loved telling his wealthy friends that his family owned a foundation, but he had absolutely no interest in the actual human lives being saved by it. He only cared about the real estate. The workshop sat on 10 acres of prime riverfront property. Over the last decade, the city had gentrified rapidly around it. Old warehouses had been torn down and replaced with boutique coffee shops and multimillion-dollar apartments. The Callaway land was a gold mine just waiting to be sold, and Vance had been drooling over it for years. Grandpa Arthur had always adamantly refused to sell. He put the land and the business into the Callaway Family Trust, specifically structuring it so that the foundation would have a permanent home. But as Grandpa got older and his health began to slightly slow him down, Vance started circling like a vulture. He realized that if he could gain control of the trust, He could bypass Grandpa's wishes, bulldoze the workshop, sell the land to developers, and take a massive percentage for himself. The first real warning sign that Vance was actively making his move happened 4 months before the birthday dinner. My parents had invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. Usually, these dinners were just an excuse for my mother to cook a massive roast and listen to Vance talk about his incredible life while I sat quietly and ate. But this time, Vance brought a projector and a laptop. He stood at the head of the dining room table, wearing a crisp blue shirt, and launched into a highly rehearsed PowerPoint presentation. He called it the Callaway Legacy, a modernization strategy. I sat there, watching in silent disbelief as he clicked through slides showing sleek, glass-front luxury condominiums, rooftop infinity pools, and high-end retail spaces. He was proposing that the family trust sell the entire Callaway Works property to Mercer Lane Development. "The industrial era is over," Vance declared, pacing around the table like a tech CEO giving a keynote speech. "Grandpa built an amazing thing, but holding onto that rusted-out warehouse is financially irresponsible. The land is heavily underutilized. We are sitting on tens of millions of dollars of trapped equity." My mother was practically glowing with pride. "It looks beautiful, Vance. It looks so high-class. But what about the foundation?" I asked, my voice cutting through his polished pitch. "What happens to the apprentices? What happens to the training facility?" Vance waved his hand dismissively. "We adapt, Caleb. We take a small portion of the sale proceeds and set up a scholarship fund. We give out a few checks a year to trade schools. We get our name on a plaque, we get a tax write-off, and we don't have to deal with running a dirty garage full of liability risks." I stared at him. He was talking about erasing 50 years of actual community impact in exchange for a plaque and a paycheck. "You can't just relocate heavy machinery training," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "And a scholarship doesn't give those kids a place to go every day. It doesn't give them a community." Vance rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, patronizing sigh. "This is exactly why you aren't in investment banking, little brother. You get too emotional about the small details. You can't see the big picture. We have a fiduciary duty to maximize the assets of the trust. Your duty is to uphold the intent of the trust, not liquidate it," I shot back. "And frankly, the tax implications of breaking the nonprofit covenants on that land would be a nightmare. Have you even run a basic risk assessment on the capital gains penalties?" Before Vance could answer, my father finally spoke up. But of course, it was not to defend the facts. It was to defend the peace. "Now, Caleb, let's not get hostile," my father said, refusing to look me in the eye. "Your brother has clearly put a lot of work into this presentation. We should be open-minded. He is trying to sell Grandpa's life's work," I said, my voice hardening. "He is trying to secure our future," my mother snapped, slamming her wine glass down on the table. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "Why do you always have to do this, Caleb? Why must you always tear down your brother's ambitions? You are so intensely negative. You should be grateful Vance has the vision to handle these high-level business matters, so you don't have to worry about them." I looked at my mother, then at my father, who was suddenly very interested in cutting his roast beef. They were completely brainwashed. They were willing to let Vance destroy our family's only honorable achievement just so they could brag about his success. I did not argue further. I closed my mouth, put my napkin on the table, and finished my meal in silence. I realized then that facts did not matter in this house. Logic was viewed as an attack. I could not protect the workshop by arguing with them at a dinner table. If I wanted to stop Vance, I had to stop treating him like an annoying brother and start treating him like a hostile corporate entity. The absolute breaking point, the moment the good son officially died and the auditor took complete control, happened 2 weeks later at the workshop. I had stopped by Callaway Works after my office job to help Grandpa run the quarterly payroll. It was late afternoon, and most of the apprentices had gone home. As I walked down the metal staircase toward the main floor, I heard shouting echoing through the cavernous space. It was Vance. He was wearing a trench coat, standing aggressively over Leo, the young apprentice. Leo was wiping his grease-covered hands on a rag, looking tense but keeping his ground. "I don't care what you were told to do," Vance snapped, pointing a manicured finger at the kid. "You move those old generator blocks out of the loading bay by tomorrow morning. I have surveyors coming to measure the square footage, and I will not have them tripping over your garbage." "Mr. Arthur told me to stage them there for rebuilding," Leo replied firmly. "I don't take orders from you." Vance stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate the younger man. "Listen to me, you little punk. You think you have job security because my grandfather pities you? You are a charity case. You are a drain on this family's resources. In a few months, this entire rusted dump is going to be bulldozed, and you are going to be right back out on the street where you belong. So you will move the scrap metal or I will fire you right now." I felt my blood turn to ice. It was one thing for Vance to be arrogant at a dinner table. It was another thing entirely for him to come into a sanctuary and psychologically abuse a kid who had nothing. I walked out of the shadows. "Step away from him, Vance." Vance spun around, startled, but quickly recovered his sneer. "Oh look, the accountant is here to save the day." "Leo, go take your break," I said, not taking my eyes off my brother. Leo nodded gratefully and hurried out the back door. "You have absolutely no authority here," I told Vance. "Grandpa has not agreed to sell. You have no right to bring surveyors onto this property." "It's a formality," Vance scoffed, waving me off. He turned to leave, grabbing his expensive leather briefcase from a nearby workbench. As he yanked it toward him, the clasp snagged on a vice grip, popping the briefcase open. A stack of manila folders spilled out, scattering across the oily concrete floor. Vance cursed loudly and scrambled to pick them up, looking panicked for a split second. He was moving fast, haphazardly shoving papers back into the leather bag. I stepped forward to help, not out of kindness, but out of instinct. I picked up a thick white envelope that had slid near my boot. Before I handed it back, my eyes naturally scanned the return address. It was not from Mercer Lane Development. It was from a company called Apex Forwarding LLC, located at a post office box in Delaware. The document peeking out of the windowed envelope looked like a wire transfer confirmation. Vance snatched the envelope out of my hand so aggressively he almost tore the paper. "Don't touch my confidential files," he hissed, his face flushing red. He snapped the briefcase shut and stormed out of the warehouse without another word. I stood alone in the quiet workshop, the smell of diesel fuel thick in the air. My mind, trained to recognize anomalies, was racing. Why was an investment broker, whose primary job was supposedly negotiating a straight real estate sale for the family trust, receiving confidential financial documents from a completely unknown LLC in Delaware? Delaware is notorious in the financial world. It is the easiest state in the country to set up a shell company to hide assets and obscure ownership. A normal brother might have just thought Vance was being secretive. But I am an auditor. I know what a red flag looks like. Vance was not just trying to sell the property. He was trying to hide something in the margins. That was the moment the switch flipped in my brain. I realized that reasoning with my family was a waste of breath. My parents would enable him until the very end. The only way to protect Grandpa Arthur, to protect Leo, and to protect myself was to completely destroy Vance's ability to operate. I stopped being the quiet brother who absorbed the abuse. I walked up to the small office, booted up my laptop, and went to war. I did not scream. I did not confront my parents. I did not send angry text messages to the family group chat. I went completely silent. Over the next 3 weeks, whenever I was not at my day job, I was sitting in the dark of my apartment, running a full-scale digital autopsy on my own brother. Forensic accounting is not magic. It is simply weaponized patience. Most criminals get caught not because of one massive mistake, but because of 1,000 tiny, lazy habits. They leave digital footprints. They reuse passwords, they link burner companies to their personal phone numbers, and they assume that because a document is buried in a PDF, nobody will ever read it. They rely on the fact that most people find financial documents boring. Fortunately for me, I find them deeply fascinating. My first target was Apex Forwarding LLC. I logged into the Public Business Registry database for the state of Delaware. Delaware allows companies to remain highly anonymous, but nothing is completely invisible if you know which threads to pull. I pulled the initial articles of incorporation. The registered agent was a generic corporate services firm, a classic dead end. But then I cross-referenced the date of incorporation. Apex Forwarding had been legally formed exactly 5 days after Vance gave his modernization PowerPoint presentation to our parents. The timing was entirely too perfect. I needed to connect Vance directly to the shell company. I started digging into open-source intelligence. I searched for the specific mailing address attached to Apex. It was a virtual mailbox service. I then ran a reverse lookup on the IP addresses associated with the domain name registered to Apex Forwarding. It led back to a server hosting provider. Then I did something incredibly simple. I went to the state's Uniform Commercial Code database. When a business takes out a secured loan, they have to file public documents listing the collateral. I searched the database for Callaway Works. What I found made my stomach drop. There was a recently filed lien against the Callaway Workshop property. Someone had taken out a $2 million commercial bridge loan, using the 10 acres of riverfront land as collateral. The lender was a subsidiary of Mercer Lane Development. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor, my pulse pounding in my ears. Grandpa Arthur owned the trust. He was the only person who had the legal authority to authorize a loan against the property. But Grandpa despised debt. He had paid off the warehouse mortgage 30 years ago and swore he would never put the land at risk again. He would never agree to this. I downloaded the loan origination documents. The signature on the bottom was not Grandpa's. It was Vance's. Vance had used a power of attorney document. I pulled that file next. It was a limited power of attorney that Grandpa had signed 2 years ago, specifically granting Vance the ability to manage standard stock portfolio rebalancing for the trust while Grandpa was recovering from a minor surgery. It absolutely did not grant Vance the authority to encumber physical real estate. Vance had taken an outdated, limited legal document, presented it to a hungry, careless loan officer at Mercer Lane, and convinced them he had executive control. He had illegally mortgaged our grandfather's legacy. The puzzle pieces were clicking together with terrifying speed, but I needed the final link. I had the crime. Vance fraudulently leveraged the property. But I needed the motive. Where did the $2 million go? I had read-only access to the primary checking account of the Callaway Family Trust, set up years ago so I could run the foundation's payroll. I logged into the banking portal and began exporting the transaction history for the last 90 days into a massive spreadsheet. I ran a pivot table filtering for outgoing wire transfers. And there it was. 2 days after the Mercer Lane Bridge loan was deposited into the trust account, there was an outgoing wire transfer for $250,000. The memo line simply read, "Pre-development site consultation fees." The receiving account belonged to Apex Forwarding LLC. Vance had taken out a fraudulent loan against Grandpa's property, dumped the money into the family trust, and was now systematically siphoning it out under the guise of fake consulting fees, sending it directly into his own offshore shell company. He was literally embezzling money from his own family to fund his luxurious lifestyle, and he was using a fake real estate deal to cover his tracks. If Mercer Lane actually ended up buying the property, the loan would be absorbed in the sale, and Vance would walk away with his stolen fees, completely unnoticed. But if the sale fell through, or if Grandpa refused to sign the final deeds, the $2 million loan would default. Mercer Lane would foreclose, they would seize the Callaway Works property, kick out all the apprentices, and Vance would still keep the cash he had already stolen. It was a win-win for him, and a death sentence for everyone else. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in the dark room. A deep, dark sense of satisfaction washed over me. Vance thought he was a genius. He thought he was playing high-level corporate chess, laughing at his boring little brother who just looked at spreadsheets all day. He didn't realize that the spreadsheet is the only place where the truth cannot hide. I did not stop there. I spent the next 4 days compiling every single piece of evidence. I printed the Delaware registry files. I printed the fraudulent power of attorney. I printed the wire transfer logs, highlighting the routing numbers that directly connected the trust to Apex Forwarding. I even managed to find a digital footprint linking Vance's personal cell phone number as the recovery contact for the Apex email server. I built a 40-page dossier. It was clean, indexed, and completely irrefutable. It was not a document of sibling rivalry. It was a federal indictment waiting to happen. It was a masterclass in financial destruction. Once the binder was complete, I knew I could not just hand it to my parents. They would panic. My mother would immediately try to destroy the evidence to protect Vance, claiming it was a misunderstanding. She would use her advanced skills in cognitive dissonance to convince herself that Vance had just made a clerical error and that I was trying to ruin his life out of spite. There was only one person in the family who respected the cold, hard truth as much as I did. The day before the big birthday dinner, I drove to Grandpa Arthur's house. I did not call ahead. I walked into his study, where he was reading the morning paper. I placed the thick binder on his mahogany desk. "What is this, Caleb?" he asked, looking over his reading glasses. "This is not a family disagreement, Grandpa," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "This is a detailed record of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Vance has secretly mortgaged the workshop. He is stealing from the trust." Grandpa stared at me for a long moment. He did not ask if I was sure. He knew I never spoke without the math to back it up. He simply reached out, opened the binder, and began to read. I stood in silence for 45 minutes while the man who built our family name watched his golden grandson tear it to shreds on paper. When he finally closed the folder, his face was like carved stone. He looked up at me. "Who else knows about this?" "Only you and me." Grandpa Arthur nodded slowly. He tapped his fingers against the leather cover of the binder. "Vance has invited the Mercer Lane developers to my birthday dinner tomorrow night. He told your mother it is a surprise celebration of a new partnership. He plans to corner you," I said. "He wants to use the pressure of a public setting with the family and the buyers present to force you to sign the final sale agreement. If you sign, it covers his tracks. If you don't, the loan defaults and they take the land anyway." "I see," Grandpa said softly. He placed his hands flat on the desk, his eyes hardening with a quiet, terrible resolve. "Let him put on his show, Caleb. Let him bring his investors. We will let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly can. And then we will bury him in it." The puzzle pieces were clicking together with terrifying speed, but I needed the final, undeniable link. I had the crime. Vance fraudulently leveraged the property. But I needed the exact motive. Where did the $2 million from the Mercer Lane bridge loan actually go? Because of my role helping Grandpa Arthur with the foundation's payroll, I had read-only access to the primary checking account of the Callaway Family Trust. I logged into the secure banking portal, bypassed the two-factor authentication, and began exporting the transaction history for the last 90 days into a massive raw data spreadsheet. I ran a complex pivot table, filtering specifically for outgoing wire transfers that exceeded $10,000. And right there, buried in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon batch processing file, it was staring me in the face. 2 days after the Mercer Lane bridge loan was deposited into the family trust account, there was a massive outgoing wire transfer for $250,000. The memo line was intentionally vague. It simply read, "Pre-development site consultation and zoning evaluation fees." The receiving account routing number belonged to Apex Forwarding LLC. Vance had taken out a fraudulent commercial loan against Grandpa's property, dumped the money into the family trust to make it look legitimate, and was now systematically siphoning it out under the guise of fake consulting fees. He was sending the cash directly into his own offshore shell company. He was literally embezzling $250,000 from his own family to fund his luxurious, fake lifestyle and he was using a hypothetical real estate deal to cover his tracks. It was a brilliantly evil, desperate move. If Mercer Lane actually ended up buying the property, the $2 million loan would simply be absorbed in the final sale paperwork, and Vance would walk away with his stolen consultation fees completely unnoticed. But if the sale fell through, or if Grandpa Arthur absolutely refused to sign the final deeds, the $2 million loan would go into default. Mercer Lane would aggressively foreclose on the collateral, they would seize the Callaway Works property, kick out all the apprentices, and Vance would still keep the cash he had already stolen. It was a win-win scenario for him, and an absolute death sentence for everyone else. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the dual monitors reflecting in the dark room. A deep, dark sense of absolute satisfaction washed over me. Vance thought he was a genius. He thought he was playing high-level corporate chess, secretly laughing at his boring little brother who just looked at spreadsheets all day. He did not realize that the spreadsheet is the only place on earth where the truth cannot hide. I did not stop there, and I certainly did not call the police. Calling the police right away would give Vance a chance to hire a defense attorney and spin a narrative. He would claim it was a clerical error, a misunderstanding of his power of attorney, or an accidental transfer. I needed to ensure that when the trap finally snapped shut, there was absolutely zero room for interpretation. I spent the next 4 days compiling every single piece of evidence. Forensic accounting is all about the chain of custody. I printed the Delaware Business Registry files, highlighting the date of incorporation that perfectly matched Vance's initial presentation. I printed the fraudulent power of attorney document, placing it side by side with Grandpa Arthur's actual, current legal signatures to show the obvious discrepancies. I printed the banking wire transfer logs, highlighting the specific routing numbers that directly connected the Callaway Family Trust to Apex Forwarding. But my absolute masterpiece was tracking the digital footprint. Using a few basic open-source intelligence tools, I managed to find a cached system log linking Vance's personal cell phone number as the two-factor authentication recovery contact for the Apex Forwarding email server. I built a 40-page dossier. I put it in a thick black leather binder. I organized it with numbered tabs, a table of contents, and an executive summary. It was clean, clinically indexed, and completely irrefutable. It was not a messy document born out of sibling rivalry. It was a federal indictment waiting to happen. It was a masterclass in financial destruction. Once the binder was complete, I knew I could not just hand it to my parents. They would completely panic. My mother would immediately try to physically destroy the evidence to protect Vance, claiming I was invading his privacy. She would use her advanced skills in cognitive dissonance to convince herself that Vance had just made a minor accounting error and that I was trying to ruin his life out of pure spite. There was only one person in this family who respected the cold, hard truth as much as I did. The day before the big 82nd birthday dinner, I drove to Grandpa Arthur's house. I did not call ahead. I just walked into his oak-paneled study, where he was sitting in his armchair reading the morning paper. I placed the thick black binder directly on his mahogany desk. "What is this, Caleb?" he asked, looking over the rim of his reading glasses. "This is not a family disagreement, Grandpa," I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "This is a highly detailed, chronological record of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and forgery. Vance has secretly mortgaged the workshop. He is stealing cash directly from the trust." Grandpa Arthur stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He did not ask me if I was sure. He knew I never spoke without the math to back it up. He simply reached out with his weathered hands, opened the binder, and began to read. I stood in total silence for 45 minutes while the man who painstakingly built our family name watched his golden grandson tear it to shreds on paper. When he finally reached the last page, he closed the folder. His face was like carved stone. He looked up at me, his eyes entirely unreadable. "Who else knows about this?" "Only you and me," I replied. Grandpa Arthur nodded slowly. He tapped his thick fingers against the leather cover of the binder. "Vance has invited the Mercer Lane developers to my birthday dinner tomorrow night. He told your mother it is a surprise celebration of a new corporate partnership." He plans to corner you, I said, leaning against the desk. He wants to use the immense social pressure of a public setting, with the family, the foundation donors, and the buyers present, to force you to sign the final sale agreement. If you sign it, it covers his tracks completely. If you do not, the bridge loan defaults and they take the land anyway. I see, Grandpa said softly. He placed both hands flat on the desk, his eyes hardening with a quiet, terrible resolve. Let him put on his show, Caleb. Let him bring his fancy investors. We will let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly can in front of an audience. And then we will bury him in it. That brings us back to the present moment. The private dining room at the riverfront restaurant. The clinking glasses, the expensive wine, and the suffocating tension. Vance was holding court at the center of the table, entirely unaware that the grave he had dug for me was actually his own. Before he had delivered his brutal line about me being a disgrace, he had spent the first hour of the dinner practically glowing with self-importance. He was performing for Mr. Sterling, the senior acquisitions director from Mercer Lane Development, who sat near the corner looking like a shark waiting to be fed. Vance had steered every single conversation back to his own brilliance. He talked about the riverfront property like he had personally discovered it, not like our grandfather had spent half his life saving it from creditors, floods, and economic downturns. We have to look toward the future, Mr. Sterling, Vance had said smoothly, swirling a glass of $200 Cabernet. The Callaway legacy is not about rusted pipes and old generators. It is about synergy. It is about adapting assets to meet modern market demands. My grandfather built the foundation, but I am the one steering the ship into the 21st century. My mother had beamed at him, completely entranced by his corporate buzzwords. Vance is just so incredibly driven. She whispered loudly to a foundation donor sitting next to her. He carries the entire weight of the family's business on his shoulders. I had sat quietly, eating my dinner, watching Vance inflate himself like a balloon. I knew the psychology of a narcissist. If you attack them directly, they play the victim. But if you feed their ego, if you make them feel like they are the smartest person in the room, they will gladly confess to everything just to claim the credit. After the main course was cleared, Vance stood up to give a toast. He thanked the guests, he gave a patronizing nod to our grandfather, and then he began to subtly lay the groundwork for the sale. He talked about making difficult executive decisions. He talked about streamlining the trust's portfolio. That was when I decided to hand him the rope. So, Vance, I said, speaking up for the first time all evening. My voice was calm, cutting effortlessly through his speech. Just to be completely clear, because I know Mr. Sterling from Mercer Lane is here tonight. You are the sole architect of this new modernization strategy, correct? Vance paused, looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and superiority. He saw an opportunity to put me in my place in front of the developer. Yes, Caleb, I am. While you are busy auditing petty cash drawers, I have been working tirelessly for the last 6 months to structure a massive, highly complex acquisition deal that will secure our family's wealth for generations. And you handled all the preliminary financing yourself? I asked, maintaining a look of polite curiosity. The risk assessments, the securing of capital? Absolutely, Vance declared, puffing out his chest. He looked directly at Mr. Sterling, wanting to make sure the developer knew who was boss. I structured the entire bridge loan personally. I navigated the legal hurdles. I am the one who initiated the corporate restructuring to facilitate this transition. It requires a level of aggressive financial maneuvering that, quite frankly, nobody else in this family has the stomach for. I gave him a slow, single nod. Thank you for clarifying that on the record, Vance. Vance frowned slightly, confused by my lack of argument, but his ego quickly overrode his suspicion. He turned back to the room, ready to deliver his final blow, ready to declare me unworthy of the family name. And he did. He looked right at me and said I was a disgrace to the legacy. He expected me to shatter. Instead, I just looked at Grandpa Arthur. The silence in the room after Grandpa Arthur stood up and mentioned federal prison was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that happens right before a massive explosion. Vance's face was completely bloodless. The arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. "What?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Grandpa, no. You cannot say things like that." Grandpa Arthur did not raise his voice. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out the executive summary from my binder, and dropped it onto the white tablecloth. $2 million, Grandpa said, his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "That is the exact amount of the commercial lien you fraudulently secured against the Callaway Works property. You used an outdated, expired power of attorney to bypass my signature. You committed felony forgery to mortgage land you do not own, and you did it behind my back." Vance's hands started to visibly shake. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice jumping an octave. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Caleb made that up. He is trying to sabotage me." I did not flinch. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the secure USB flash drive, and set it on the table next to the paper. "There are no lies on that drive, Vance," I said, my voice cold and clinical. "Only banking routing numbers. Step 1 was getting the fraudulent loan. Step 2 was getting the cash out before the property sold. So, you set up Apex Forwarding LLC in Delaware. And 2 days after the loan cleared, you wired $250,000 directly into your own shell company." I turned my attention to Mr. Sterling. The developer was already pushing his chair back, his face a mask of absolute horror. "Mr. Sterling," I said politely, "my brother did not have the legal authority to sign that loan agreement. If Mercer Lane Development attempts to collect on that fraudulent lien or proceeds with this acquisition, your firm will be heavily implicated as an accessory to federal wire fraud and embezzlement. The Securities and Exchange Commission will absolutely love going through your underwriting department's emails." Sterling did not hesitate. In the corporate world, loyalty only exists until the subpoenas start flying. He stood up abruptly. "Mercer Lane Development has absolutely no knowledge of any fraudulent activity," he announced to the room, his voice clipped. "Any agreements made with Vance Callaway are immediately terminated." He did not even look at Vance. He grabbed his briefcase, turned on his heel, and practically ran out of the private dining room. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind the developer, sealing Vance's fate. He watched his entire future, his status, and his stolen fortune walk right out the door. He began to hyperventilate. The narcissist's ultimate nightmare was happening in real time. He was being publicly exposed, stripped of his power, and abandoned by his audience. He immediately deployed the only defense mechanism he had left: DARVO. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. "You set me up," Vance screamed, slamming both fists onto the table, so hard the expensive wine glasses tipped over, spilling red wine across the white linen like blood. Tears of pure, unadulterated rage sprang to his eyes. He glared at me, his face twisted in genuine hatred. "You planned this. You hacked into my private files. You manipulated the data to make me look guilty. You are destroying this family. Caleb." My mother burst into hysterical tears. She stood up, knocking her chair backward. "Stop it. Both of you, stop it right now," she sobbed, rushing to stand behind Vance, wrapping her arms around his shoulders to shield him. "Arthur, you cannot let Caleb do this. Vance was just trying to help the family. He just made a mistake. We can fix the paperwork. We can pay the money back. Do not let Caleb send his brother to prison." Even faced with absolute, undeniable proof that her favorite son had robbed the family blind, her brain aggressively refused to accept reality. To her, Vance was still the victim of my cruel accounting. I looked at my mother, and I felt nothing but cold exhaustion. "He did not make a mistake, Mom," I said. "A mistake is forgetting a decimal point. Forging a legal document and wiring $250,000 to a secret offshore account is a premeditated felony. He is a thief." Grandpa Arthur turned to Mr. Bell, our family attorney, who had been sitting quietly, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. "Mr. Bell, Effective immediately, Vance is removed from all advisory boards related to the Callaway Trust. You will draft a formal cease and desist letter banning him from the workshop property. Furthermore, you will initiate the process to legally sever him entirely as a beneficiary of my estate. My father finally gasped, his head snapping up. Arthur, wait. You are disinheriting him? I am excising a tumor, Robert, Grandpa replied without looking at him. And you should be deeply ashamed of yourself for sitting by in silence while your son tried to steal the ground out from under us. Grandpa turned back to Vance. You have exactly 48 hours to wire every single cent of the stolen $250,000 back into the trust account. If the balance is not restored to the penny by Tuesday morning, Caleb will hand his dossier over to the authorities, and I will personally pay the attorneys to ensure you receive the maximum federal sentence. Now get out of my sight. Vance opened his mouth, but he had absolutely no leverage left. He had no charm, no investors, and no family protection. He was entirely bankrupt, morally and professionally. He stood up, his legs shaking visibly. He grabbed his coat, violently pushed past my weeping mother, and stumbled out of the restaurant. The birthday dinner was over. The remaining guests quietly excused themselves, murmuring polite apologies to Grandpa, recognizing that this was a deeply private tragedy. Within 10 minutes, the only people left in the private dining room were Grandpa, Mr. Bell, my parents, and me. My mother was sitting in her chair, weeping uncontrollably into a cloth napkin. My father was rubbing his temples, completely paralyzed. They had invested their entire identities into Vance's success, and they were entirely unprepared for his spectacular collapse. Grandpa Arthur walked slowly around the long table and stopped beside my chair. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. You did good, Caleb, he said softly. You protected the workshop. You protected the kids. You protected the truth. I am sorry it had to happen on your birthday, Grandpa, I replied. He squeezed my shoulder. Sometimes the best gift is finally seeing clearly. He turned toward my parents. Take yourselves home. I do not want to hear another word defending him. If you try to pay back the stolen money for him out of your own retirement accounts, I will press charges anyway. He faces the consequences of his actions. That is final. Over the next few months, the fallout was absolute and brutal. Vance managed to scrape together the stolen money just hours before the Tuesday deadline. He had to completely drain his personal bank accounts, max out his credit cards, and liquidate his entire retirement portfolio at a massive penalty. He technically avoided federal prison, but his career was instantly annihilated. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, rumors move faster than light. Word leaked that Mercer Lane Development had pulled out of a massive deal because Vance had attempted a fraudulent lien. No legitimate brokerage firm would ever hire him. He lost his downtown loft, his leased Porsche was repossessed in the middle of the night, and he was forced to move into a cheap, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. He did not lose everything, but he lost the only thing he actually cared about, the illusion that he was important. Grandpa Arthur officially amended the Callaway Family Trust. He completely removed Vance and my parents from any future decision-making power. Instead, he appointed me as the sole primary trustee and the executor of his estate. I did not take a salary from the foundation, but I took over all the financial oversight. I ensured that the books were airtight, the property taxes were paid early, and the apprenticeship programs were fully funded for the next 50 years. I spent my weekends down at the shop, watching Leo and the new kids learn how to weld, knowing that no slick broker in a $5,000 suit would ever be able to take this away from them. My parents, predictably, suffered a massive psychological break. They could not process the fact that their golden child was a complete failure. My mother tried to rewrite history, telling relatives that Vance had simply been the victim of aggressive corporate regulations. But behind closed doors, they were desperate. They began bombarding my phone with calls and long, highly emotional text messages. They begged me to speak to Grandpa. They begged me to secretly lend Vance money to help him get back on his feet. They told me that family is supposed to forgive, that I needed to be the bigger person, and that holding on to anger was toxic. It is amazing how quickly enablers weaponize the concept of forgiveness when they are the ones finally suffering the consequences. For 32 years, my silence was expected. My boundaries were completely ignored. Now that I finally had the power, they expected me to immediately surrender it to maintain their comfort. I did not argue with them. I did not send them a detailed list of their failures as parents. I simply applied the same forensic discipline to my personal life that I applied to my job. I permanently severed the connection. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Vance on every conceivable platform. I routed all family emails directly to a spam folder. I established a titanium boundary. I realized that keeping them in my life would mean subjecting myself to an endless, draining cycle of guilt trips and manipulation. I chose my own peace over their dysfunction. That night at the restaurant did not magically heal my family. Real life does not work that way, but it gave me absolute proof that I was never the problem. I had only been standing in a room where the wrong people completely refused to see my value. I learned a very hard, very cold lesson through all of this. A family name is just a random collection of letters you are assigned at birth. It does not guarantee loyalty, it does not mandate respect, and it certainly does not mean you have to tolerate financial or emotional abuse. People will try to use the concept of family to trap you, to silence you, and to force you to accept less than you deserve. But your dignity is entirely your own. Your integrity is the paper trail of your life. You do not have to scream to be heard. You do not have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes, the most devastatingly powerful thing you can do is gather your facts, stand your absolute ground, and quietly let the toxic people in your life destroy themselves with their own breathtaking arrogance. I walked away from my family, and in doing so, I finally found my freedom.